As your new wife, I'm graciously allowing your mother to live in my old apartment, Jasmine announced, gripping the microphone in the center of the banquet hall. A murmur of approval swept through the tables. Some guests applauded politely. Others nodded with admiring smiles. I stood near the head table, clutching a glass of champagne I no longer had the stomach to drink, feeling every pair of eyes in the room pivot toward me, waiting for my reaction. The ballroom was dead silent, waiting for the expected performance. They wanted to see the trembling hands of a grateful widow, a tearful nod of acceptance, or perhaps a minor, embarrassing emotional breakdown. I didn't give them the satisfaction. I didn't scream, and I didn't look at my new daughter-in-law, Jasmine, with pleading eyes. Instead, anger took on a clinical chill. It wasn't loud. It was a simple, mathematical realization that my baseline boundaries had just been completely overrun. I looked down at the champagne glass in my hand. With absolute physical precision, I lowered it onto the pristine white linen tablecloth. I made sure it didn't wobble. I didn't say a single word to the hundreds of high society guests staring from tables draped in expensive white hydrangeas. I looped the strap of my structured handbag over my arm, turned away from the head table, and began to walk. My steps were steady, measured, and entirely deliberate. I could feel the heat of their collective stares burning into my back, but I carried myself with an icy detachment. This wasn't a breakdown. It was an audit. I had been the silent investor in their version of family affection for far too long, and the account was officially closed. As I reached the grand mahogany doors of the Savannah banquet hall, a heavy hand gripped my elbow. It was Brandon. His face was flushed, a deep crimson, his breath smelling of the top-shelf liquor I had indirectly funded. He leaned in, his voice a sharp, furious hiss, meant to stay hidden from the crowd. "Mom, what the hell are you doing?" Brandon muttered, trying to pull me into the shadows of the empty foyer. "You are completely ruining my wedding day over a ridiculous whim. Jasmine's family is just trying to streamline the logistics. You have plenty of room at the Brick Manor house, and you're being incredibly difficult in front of everyone who matters." I looked directly into my son's eyes, but I didn't see the boy I had raised alone. I saw a transactional climber who had traded his mother's safety for an executive seat in his father-in-law's crumbling hierarchy. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I pulled my arm out of his grip with a slow, unbreakable strength. "Your wedding day is over for me, Brandon," I said, my voice completely flat, drained of all maternal warmth, "and your in-laws have exactly 48 hours to clear their inventory out of my borders." I didn't wait for his reaction. I turned and walked straight out of the building. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. The cool, damp air of the Savannah night hit my face, clearing away the suffocating scent of expensive catering and artificial harmony. My hands were steady as I dug for my keys. I unlocked my vehicle, climbed inside, and immediately engaged the locks. The click of the automated security system echoed like a gavel in the quiet cabin. I started the engine and shifted into drive, leaving the venue lights behind. This wasn't family drama anymore. It was a defensive strike. The headlights of my car cut through the heavy darkness of the coastal highway, illuminating the ancient oak trees wrapped in Spanish moss. Jasmine's rehearsed words looped in my mind. Fair. She had used that word like it was a universal truth, a simple economic calculation that justified deleting my existence to stabilize her family's failing dynamic. There was nothing fair about a subscription where I footed the bill. My compassion had been a luxury asset they had overdrafted for years, and tonight, the balance sheet had finally hit absolute zero. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white under the dim dashboard lights. For 30 years, I had worked as an industrial logistics supervisor at the manufacturing plant. 30 years of tracking freight manifests, managing chaotic supply chains, and standing on cold concrete floors until my joints ached and my lower back burned with a dull, constant fire. When my wedding partner died, Brandon was 5. I didn't have the luxury of collapsing into grief or taking time off to heal. I had to ensure our survival. Every dollar saved by cutting meat or walking in the rain went toward a sanctuary. I scraped together $120,000 for the down payment on that Pecan Grove estate, entirely on my own, through years of unrelenting thrift and ironclad savings. As the highway narrowed, the familiar scent of wet earth, damp brick, and crushed pecan shells began to drift through the vents. This land wasn't just a piece of real estate. It was my unyielding boundary. It was the physical manifestation of 30 years of survival. Brandon had grown up watching me sacrifice my own comfort to protect his future. He had seen me wear the same faded winter coat for 6 seasons straight so he could attend an out-of-state university. But somewhere along the line, he stopped seeing those sacrifices as a gift to be respected. He began to view them as a baseline debt, an entitlement that automatically extended into my old age. I approached the heavy iron gates of the estate, and my chest tightened. They were wide open, pushed back brutally into the grass as if my borders were public property. Looking at those gates, a heavy realization settled over me. For years, I had allowed Brandon to push the edges of my life. I had smiled politely at Jasmine's casual disdain and stayed silent during their exclusions. I used to think my silence was love. What people often misunderstand about survival is how easily it can transform into a prison without bars. My protective maternal instincts had slowly manifested as a pattern of learned helplessness, a silent compliance that inadvertently taught Brandon my boundaries didn't exist. I had conditioned him to believe I was a utility, not a human being. But that invisible chain was officially broken tonight. The compliance was gone, replaced by a cold, clinical clarity. I pulled down the gravel driveway, the brick manor house glowing under the moonlight. The invasion was real, but so was the upcoming reckoning. I pushed the heavy front door open, and the layout of my home hit me like an unauthorized corporate liquidation. Cardboard boxes were stacked 3 high against the historic wainscoting. My custom heritage belongings, pieces of furniture I had carefully restored with my own hands, were already being cataloged and packed away as if I were a ghost who had vanished decades ago. In the kitchen, Patricia stood over my antique stove, while Gregory rifled through my pantry. At the dining table sat Stephanie, casually sipping tea from a delicate piece of heirloom china my mother had left me. They turned to look at me with a supreme, unbothered arrogance. "Jasmine said you were on your way," Patricia said with a tight, performance-ready smile, wiping her hands on my dish towel. "We wanted to get an early start on organizing the rooms. It's just more efficient if we get settled while you handle the logistics of moving your things to the downtown penthouse." "Get out of my house," I said. My voice wasn't loud. It carried the exact same analytical precision I used when rejecting a defective freight delivery at the manufacturing plant. "All 3 of you. Right now." Stephanie set the china cup down with a sharp click, her mouth tightening into a thin line of absolute disdain. "You're completely overreacting. We are going through a critical financial restructuring. This estate is massive, and you're just one person. It's incredibly slippery and selfish to hoard this much space when Jasmine is graciously offering you her property in exchange." Instead of arguing, Patricia immediately pulled out her phone. Within seconds, my screen began to vibrate with incoming text alerts. A toxic notification bomb exploded across the family group chat. Patricia was typing furiously, broadcasting a frantic narrative that I had returned from the wedding in a state of unstable, unhinged rage, threatening a broke family in their hour of need. Then came Brandon's digital footprint, a barrage of desperate, furious texts screaming that I was destroying his new life, demanding I stop playing the victim, and telling me to cooperate before I embarrassed him further. They looked at me with an air of absolute triumph, confident that the social pressure would break me, but they had miscalculated the fundamental nature of our interaction. They had fallen directly into the trap of cruel normalization. Parasitic personalities like Patricia and Gregory don't view themselves as thieves or trespassers. Over years of high society entitlement, they have conditioned their minds to believe that their financial emergencies automatically invalidate anyone else's legal rights. They had mapped their corporate failures onto my legacy land, deciding that my independent success was a resource they had a natural right to liquidate. They normalized the cruelty of evicting a widow because, in their shallow hierarchy, an invisible worker exists only to absorb the debts of the elite. I didn't answer Brandon's texts. I didn't engage in their toxic psychological theater. I closed the group chat window, opened my contact list, and dialed a number I had kept secured for years. I called Marcus. He wasn't a family mediator or a counselor. He was an elite property litigator who treated land disputes with lethal corporate finality. "Marcus," I said, looking directly through Gregory as he stepped forward to intimidate me, "I have an active property breach at the legacy pecan estate. 3 unauthorized individuals have established a parasitic threshold inside my manor house. I need an ironclad, Formal legal trespass ultimatum drafted immediately. Give them exactly 48 hours to clear their inventory, or we initiate a criminal eviction. I hung up the phone and walked out onto the porch, leaving them to face the sudden, freezing silence of a closed account. This wasn't a family squabble anymore. It was an audit, and the 48-hour clock was officially ticking. The 48-hour countdown hung over the brick manor house like a sharpening blade. Patricia, Gregory, and Stephanie remained barricaded in my guest wings, their hollow laughter echoing through the hallways, completely convinced that Brandon's emotional blackmail would eventually force me to capitulate. They assumed my maternal guilt was an exhaustible resource they could continue to exploit. But inside my bedroom, my laptop didn't reflect a mother's hesitation. It glowed with the cold, factual precision of a pending audit. Right before the legal deadline expired, my phone vibrated. It was Marcus. His voice didn't carry the standard politeness of a casual legal update. It was flat, clinical, and laced with an unspoken severity that instantly put my logistics instincts on high alert. He didn't ask how I was holding up. He simply told me to open the encrypted file he had just forwarded to my email. Catherine, this stopped being a simple residential eviction the moment I pulled the state registry records and corporate asset filings, Marcus said, the tapping of his keyboard audible over the line. Your Pecan Grove estate doesn't just hold sentimental value or mature trees. It sits directly on top of an unmapped, highly restricted subterranean artesian mineral water vein worth millions of dollars. My breath caught, but my mind remained clear. Suddenly, the puzzle pieces locked into place with terrifying alignment. This was never about providing a quiet refuge for an aging man's respiratory issues or a comforting retreat for a broken-hearted sibling. Those pretty explanations had been nothing more than a strategic distraction, a beautifully crafted smokescreen to hide an aggressive corporate asset raid. Marcus continued, delivering the absolute kill shot to any remaining shreds of familial loyalty. Jasmine's family's real estate empire wasn't just undergoing a temporary restructuring. It was entirely bankrupt, drowning in a multi-million-dollar debt matrix. They had used my stolen property data to pitch a fraudulent, multi-million-dollar land rights deal to a beverage conglomerate, attempting to secure an emergency cash advance to cover their liabilities. But the true predation lay in how they obtained the contract. Brandon had utilized his position as a corporate data analyst to flag my property's subterranean assets. He had actively combed through my private structural files, extracted the land surveys, and secretly forged my signature on a fraudulent power of attorney, forcing the asset swap agreement into a pending escrow stage before Marcus intercepted it. He had traded his own mother's lifelong sanctuary to secure an executive vice presidency seat in his father-in-law's crumbling hierarchy. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon a wave of maternal grief, but there was only absolute, icy lucidity. This wasn't a family dispute. It was grand felony property fraud and identity theft. Brandon hadn't just been a weak enabler. He was a criminal co-conspirator who had treated my 30 years of industrial sweat equity as a disposable leverage piece. Any lingering desire for an emotional reconciliation died right there on my screen. I didn't call him to scream or demand an apology. I simply forwarded the signature forgery file directly to Marcus with a single instruction: authorize the sheriff's department for a total disruption of their boundary lines. The exact minute the 48-hour legal ultimatum expired, the sharp crunch of gravel echoing down the long driveway signaled the finality of the audit. I stood on my smart grid-secured porch, watching the flashing blue lights of the county sheriff's patrol vehicle cast long, cold shadows across the legacy Pecan Grove estate. Inside the manor house, the sudden, unyielding termination of their squatter status caught Patricia and Gregory entirely off guard. They didn't look like elite real estate tycoons anymore. They looked like small, panicked liquidators scrambling to protect and elicit cash. The deputies didn't look for emotional nuance or family context. When Patricia began weeping dramatically, launching into an engineered performance about maternal cruelty and a supposed verbal agreement with my son, the lead deputy flatly dismissed the narrative. In the eyes of the law, a verbal contract with a non-owner holds zero equity. They were labeled exactly what they were on my balance sheet: unauthorized criminal trespassers executing a fraudulent property breach. As the deputies began systematically escorting them toward the estate boundaries, Brandon's luxury vehicle tore down the driveway, throwing dirt into the grass. He threw open the door and practically collapsed onto the gravel, his high society career alignment entirely shattered by the sudden filing of the signature forgery documents. The executive vice presidency seat he had traded his integrity for had evaporated into absolute nothingness before he could even collect the first corporate dividend. He ran toward the steps, his voice cracking into a desperate, hollow plea for maternal mercy, begging me to withdraw the grand felony fraud report before a felony record neutralized his data analyst career permanently. I looked down at his unraveled frame, completely unbothered by his weaponized emotional blackmail. This sudden power flip was the natural result of an unbalanced ledger. Watching them frantically cramming their personal inventory into suitcases under the cold gaze of law enforcement brought a profound sociological lesson to light. This was the absolute exposure of the illusion of power of the empty wallet. For years, Jasmine and her parents had operated with a supreme, haughty authority, looking down on my 30 years of industrial supervisor labor as if my existence were entirely second-rate. But their perceived elite status was never an asset. It was a temporary, cosmetic shell rented entirely with toxic, unsecured debt. The exact second they encountered raw, sovereign property ownership backed by a verified legal title, their manufactured leverage turned to ash. They had no intrinsic value left to stand on. Brandon wept, claiming that the family would lose everything if I didn't save them from bankruptcy. But I had already closed the credit line. My compassion was an account they had overdrawn for the last time. I reached into my handbag, pulled out a certified copy of the permanent property restriction, and let the paper drop near his fumbling hands. They weren't shocked by the severity of the law. They were shocked that I had simply stopped playing along. I didn't say goodbye. I turned around, walked back into my sanctuary, and locked the heavy oak door, leaving the final accounting to settle itself outside. A quiet winter has settled over the pecan grove, bringing a crisp, cleansing wind that rustles through the ancient branches. The chaos of that wedding night is gone, replaced by the deep, unshakable stillness of a reclaimed sanctuary. Brandon's hollow marriage fractured completely within 6 months, buckling under the weight of financial bankruptcy, exposed fraud, and the impending legal prosecution orchestrated by Marcus. Jasmine's family lost their remaining assets in a brutal, forced corporate liquidation, proving that their entire high society facade was nothing more than an empty shell. Meanwhile, with the help of my land conservationist neighbor Melissa, I successfully restored the estate's subterranean irrigation lines, formally establishing an independent land conservation trust to protect this legacy land for generations to come. Brandon attempted to send an intermediary once, trying to deploy the old, familiar scripts of maternal guilt, but those words could no longer cross my threshold. I have closed the account completely. I've come to realize that the most difficult part of this journey wasn't changing the biometric locks or involving the sheriff. It was shedding the weaponized guilt of cutting off my own biological child. Society demands that maternal love must be an endless well of compliance, an unconditional asset that allows adult children to trample your dignity in the name of blood. But that is a toxic trap. Dismantling those artificial expectations was an act of supreme moral sanity. I learned that true family is defined entirely by shared respect, consistency, and honor, not by shared DNA. Sometimes, the truest form of love you can show an entitled child is to allow them to break completely under the weight of their own destructive choices, without stepping in to cushion the fall. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes, it's the only way to set yourself free from a contract you never signed. If you find yourself in a similar situation right now, sitting in the dark and wondering if you are wrong for setting a boundary, I need you to listen to me carefully. This is a letter to those who have spent their entire lives feeling like they are standing on the edge, the reliable outsiders expected to shrink so that others can shine. You do not owe anyone your sanity or your home just because you happen to share a last name. Your life's labor is your own, and you have every legal and moral right to defend your peace. When you finally stop asking for permission to occupy your own space, you will discover a different kind of sunrise, the kind made of quiet power, self-respect, and total, unyielding freedom. If this story helped you realize that your peace is worth more than a toxic family title, hit that share button, subscribe to the channel, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's stand together.